She was England's greatest queen, the Virgin Queen Gloriana, the woman who defeated an empire and ruled alone for nearly half a century. But behind Elizabeth I's powdered face lay secrets so shocking they threatened to destroy her reign and her very identity. Today, we peel away the painted illusions to reveal 10 shocking secrets of Elizabeth I they tried to hide. Watch until number 1, a truth so horrifying it could have ended the Tudor dynasty forever. But before we begin, click like and subscribe to join history's hidden horrors, where the past never rests in peace. Secret 10. The real reason she never married. They called her the Virgin Queen, a title forged in golden portraits and sermons of divine purity. But behind the myth was a woman of blood and breath of loneliness and whispered terror. Elizabeth Tudor sat upon England's throne clothed in layers of silk and power, but her heart beat in a cage of secrets no crown could protect. She told her counselors she was married to her kingdom, that no man would ever rule over her. But late at night, candlelight flickering against her carved bedposts, what truths haunted her sleepless mind? Some say she was too wise to wed, knowing that any husband would seize her throne, steal her authority, and bind her choices. She had watched her own mother, Anne Boleyn, executed by her father. She had seen her stepmother, Catherine Howard, dragged screaming to the block. Marriage to Elizabeth was not love. It was power, betrayal, and death. Others whisper of something darker, that perhaps it was not only fear of losing power that chained her heart shut, but a fear of her own body. There were rumors carried by foreign ambassadors and court gossips alike that Elizabeth was born malformed, that she hid scars from childhood illness or bore deformities that made marital consummation impossible. Some believed she had been so traumatized as a child, her mother executed before her eyes, her father's brutal love transforming into cold abandonment, that she could never allow herself to be vulnerable to a man again. Robert Dudley, her lifelong favorite, danced at the edge of her guarded heart, but even he could not breach the fortress she built within. And then there is the deepest theory, that Elizabeth harbored a secret so terrible it could collapse the Tudor line she was unable to bear children. In an age when a queen's worth was measured by her womb, childlessness was not merely personal sorrow. It was national doom. Better perhaps to remain the untouchable Virgin Queen, divinely ordained, than to reveal to Parliament and Europe that England's throne ended with her empty cradle. So she became legend. She painted her face with white lead and crimson rouge. She adorned herself with pearls and rubies, symbols of purity and blood. She walked among her people as a living icon, untouchable, and alone, binding her fate to her kingdom in a pact of ice and iron. For in truth, Elizabeth I never married, because marriage was not freedom, nor love, nor safety. Marriage for the daughter of Henry VIII was a death sentence, and she chose life, even if it meant ruling with a heart forever encased in unbreakable glass. Secret 9, her teeth blackened and rotted away. She dazzled her court with radiant gowns stitched from gold-threaded silk. Jewels clustered around her neck like frozen drops of blood and moonlight. Her presence was fire and ice, a queen's majesty wrapped in myth. But lean closer, past the painted mask, past the perfumes that cloaked her decay, and you would recoil at the hidden rot of England's Virgin Queen. Elizabeth Tudor's teeth were once white as polished ivory. In youth, her smile charmed diplomats and disarmed rivals. But with power came indulgence, and with indulgence came a creeping horror. Sugar, that rare costly treasure of the New World, became her greatest vice. Candied fruits, marzipan, sweetmeats glazed in honey and rosewater. Her banquets overflowed with delicacies only monarchs could afford, and Elizabeth, Queen of Taste and Spectacle, devoured them in secret pleasure. But sugar was poison to Tudor teeth. Foreign ambassadors recorded it with morbid fascination. They described her blackened stumps jutting from inflamed gums, breath so fetid it coiled into the air like rot from a grave. One diplomat noted she could barely speak clearly. her tongue twisted by pain and infection. Courtiers whispered of abscesses swelling her jaw, leaking pus behind her painted lips. They spoke of her meals growing shorter, her hunger dimming into silent agony. And still she smiled with lips cracked by white lead hiding the oozing shadows within. Smiled through feasts where no one dared meet her eyes too long for fear of seeing the truth of power's decay. Smiled as her doctors plucked rotting fragments from her gums with iron forceps, no anesthetic to numb the queen's flesh from her own horror. By old age, Elizabeth had lost so many teeth. Her jaw collapsed inward, warping her face beneath layers of powder. She stuffed her mouth with rags soaked in balm to mask the void where her teeth had been. But nothing could banish the smell of slow death rising from her throat. For behind the glory of Gloriana, behind the marble statues and stained glass portraits, was a woman of bone and blood, decaying alive. Her teeth black as the secrets she carried her breath. The scent of royalty's curse power, sweetened with poison, until only rot remained. Secret 8. The obsession with her appearance. Power is a fickle mirror, and Elizabeth Tudor spent her life staring into its cracked reflection. She was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, England's immortal icon of beauty and strength. Yet beneath the powdered mask lay trembling fear, a terror that age would strip her power as surely as it stripped her flesh. Each dawn began the same an hour before sunrise. Silent maids and wary physicians gathered in her privy chamber. There, in the flickering glow of beeswax candles, they prepared the alchemy of illusion. Her face, once smooth with youth's bloom, had grown thin and hollow, her skin blotched with age and grief. But such truths could never be seen. They crushed white lead into fine poisonous powder, mixing it with vinegar and rosewater, until it formed a cold, chalky paste. Layer upon layer they painted her face, neck and chest, until her flesh gleamed like a porcelain mask. The cracks spiderwebbing across it each day were filled with fresh paste, hiding the fissures time carved upon her. On her lips, they brushed crimson vermilion, laced with mercury salts, staining her mouth blood red. Kohl lined her weary eyes, darkening them into pools of sharpened power. Over her thinning hair, they placed elaborate red wigs adorned with pearls, their stiff curls piled high to imitate youthful abundance. But the cost of such beauty was agony. The lead burned her skin, peeling it in raw sheets. Her hair fell out in clumps from mercury's poison. Sores bloomed upon her scalp and face, scabbing beneath the makeup until it cracked and bled. Yet Elizabeth would not yield. She forbade mirrors from her chambers as her age advanced, for each reflection was a betrayal, a ghost revealing her mortality. Ambassadors wrote of how she refused to appear before her counselors until fully adorned, even if war or plague knocked at England's door. In her final years, she sat for hours each day in silent ritual, her ladies daubing fresh lead onto dead skin, sealing infection beneath beauty's pale prison. They say that when her makeup was removed at night, what lay beneath was so decayed, so inflamed and ulcered, that only darkness could conceal it. But to Elizabeth, appearance was not vanity. It was survival. Her power rested upon the myth of her unchanging face, her eternal virgin beauty unmarred by time's touch. For a queen who ruled alone in a world of devouring men, the illusion of beauty was her armor. And each stroke of white lead was a whispered prayer to remain untouchable, even as the poison seeped into her blood, claiming her from within. Secret 7. Her secret love child theory. Among the marble halls and echoing galleries of Tudor palaces, one name lingered like perfume in the air: Robert Dudley. Childhood companion, sworn favorite master of the horse, and perhaps her forbidden lover. Elizabeth and Dudley's bond defied every courtly expectation. He was handsome, dark-eyed, a man of quick laughter and iron loyalty. She granted him power lands and rooms beside her own. Gossip spread like wildfire through Europe, whispering that England's Virgin Queen was no virgin at all. But there is a secret darker still that their love may have borne a child. In 1587, a young man was arrested in Spain, caught attempting to flee England under a false name. When interrogated, he claimed he was Arthur Dudley, the son of Queen Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley. His story stunned Philip II's spies. He said he had been born in secret, his mother hidden away during her confinement, and placed in the care of a loyal nurse. As he grew, those around him hinted at his true lineage. His education was of noble quality. His speech-bearing and literacy revealed aristocratic blood. But when Elizabeth learned of his existence, he claimed she ordered him exiled to hide the scandal. In Spain, he was treated with wary respect, interrogated by the king's ministers. If true, this man was not just the bastard son of a queen, he was a Tudor heir, a living threat to Elizabeth's throne and England's fragile succession. Yet the Spanish never pressed his claim. He vanished into their records like a ghost swallowed by night. Historians remain divided. Some dismiss him as a clever impostor seeking favor and safety in a foreign court. Others note how carefully Elizabeth guarded her chambers during her youthful illnesses, how fiercely Dudley's wife's sudden death was covered in rumors of poison and betrayal. For if Elizabeth had borne a child, it would have shattered her myth of virginity, undermined her political power, and sparked a dynastic crisis across Europe. Worse, it would have marked Dudley as guilty of treason, taking the Queen's body as his own. And so the tale of Arthur Dudley fades into shadow. A name on parchment. A ghost who claimed to be the hidden son of England's most powerful woman. If he spoke truth, then beneath the marble image of the Virgin Queen lies a secret grave, a child erased by royal terror. And the cost of England's golden age was paid in blood unseen, in a life born only to be forgotten. Secret 6. The Bisley Boy Theory. Among the fog-shrouded hills of Gloucestershire lies a village called Bisley, quaint quiet, and forever haunted by a legend so dark it threatens to unravel the very identity of England's greatest queen. They call it the Bisley Boy Theory. It begins with a child, Elizabeth Tudor, sent to Bisley during a plague outbreak in 1543. She was around 10 years old, the precious daughter of Henry VIII. But tragedy struck. According to the legend, the young princess fell ill and died suddenly, far from her father's court. Her governesses, paralyzed by terror, faced a fate worse than death. They had lost the king's only daughter, a political asset, a bargaining chip, a living emblem of Tudor legitimacy. Fearful of Henry VIII's wrath, they searched desperately for a replacement. And then they found him a local boy, slender, red-haired, near identical in height and age, who had been one of Elizabeth's playmates in the village. They dressed him in her gowns, taught him her mannerisms, and when the court messengers arrived, they presented him as the recovering princess. Henry VIII, rarely seeing his daughter, accepted the deception, relieved that his heir lived. From that day forward, the Bisley boy became Elizabeth Tudor. As the theory continues, the boy grew into a brilliant scholar and ruler, mastering languages, diplomacy, statecraft. He kept his secret hidden beneath elaborate gowns, thick layers of makeup, and an iron will. His refusal to marry was not chastity, but necessity, for no husband could discover the truth beneath the petticoats and pearls. Supporters of this theory point to Elizabeth's angular facial structure, her broad shoulders, her deep voice recorded in ambassadorial letters. They cite her lifelong avoidance of medical examination and the whispered horror of those who dressed her frail, scarred body in her final years. During renovations of Bisley's old cottages, villagers claimed to find a child's skeleton, dressed in Tudor-era royal clothing, hidden beneath stone floors. To them, it was proof the real Elizabeth buried in silence, while a boy ruled England in her name. Historians dismiss it as village folklore, born from centuries of fear and fascination. But what if the legend was true? What if the Virgin Queen's greatest secret was not her celibacy, but her identity? If Elizabeth was a man, then England's golden age was forged upon a deception so perfect it rewrote history itself. A boy raised into a queen, a kingdom ruled by a ghost in a woman's crown, and the greatest monarch England ever knew may have never truly existed at all. Secret 5. The Bloody Execution Orders. She was Gloriana, the radiant queen who presided over England's golden age. Her reign birthed Shakespeare's words, and Drake's voyages painted in gilded strokes by historians eager to worship their virgin queen. But beneath the veneer of poetry and prosperity lay a darker truth. Elizabeth I ruled with blood-soaked hands. When Elizabeth took the throne in 1558, she inherited a kingdom torn by religious hatred. Her half-sister Mary I had burned hundreds of Protestants alive. Elizabeth Protestant herself promised tolerance. But promises are made of breath, and power is forged in bone. Early in her reign, she signed warrants sending Catholic priests to their deaths for treason. In hidden chapels and candlelit cellars, informants whispered confessions under torture names, pouring from split lips onto parchment. To harbor a priest was to invite death. Entire families were dragged from their beds. Their homes seized, their patriarchs hanged and quartered in public squares. But her darkest order came in 1587. For nearly 2 decades, Mary Queen of Scots languished in English prisons, Elizabeth's cousin, rival, and legitimate Catholic claimant to the throne. Mary plotted rebellions with Spain, or so Elizabeth's spy master whispered. At last, worn by fear and political pressure, Elizabeth signed her cousin's death warrant. On a February dawn, Mary walked to her execution in a velvet gown of dark crimson, the color of martyrdom. She knelt before the block, praying aloud, and the executioner raised his axe. His first blow struck her skull. The second severed her neck. When he lifted her head, her wig slipped free, revealing thin gray hair clinging to an old woman's scalp. Her little dog, hidden in her skirts, crawled out, whimpering, its fur soaked in her blood. Elizabeth claimed she wept for days after. She insisted the order had been misunderstood, the warrant sent without her will. But the truth remains, it was her signature upon the page. Her fear that sealed Mary's doom. Throughout her reign, pirates were hanged at Wapping traitors, drawn and quartered at Tyburn heretics, burned for beliefs that threatened her rule. To Elizabeth, mercy was weakness. Each death was a stone laid upon the foundation of her power. For in a kingdom bound by fear, a queen's justice was written not in ink, but in blood, and Gloriana's golden legend was forged upon the screams of the dying, echoing through the hollow halls of her immortal reign. Secret 4. Her hair wasn't real. In portraits lining the silent galleries of Hampton Court and Windsor, Elizabeth I gazes out with a lion's mane of burning copper curls. Her hair flows beneath golden crowns studded with rubies, and pearls, a symbol of power and youth, immortalized in oil and canvas. But those curls were a lie, another illusion carefully crafted to conceal the decay gnawing at England's queen. When she was young, Elizabeth's hair truly burned red, as autumn fires inherited from her father, Henry VIII. But years of stress, illness, and poison seeped into her scalp, like rot into oak. Each morning, her maids found tufts of hair left behind on pillows, stained with sweat and lead powder. By her 40s, her hair thinned so drastically that bald patches glistened beneath her elaborate veils. By her 50s, her head was nearly bare. For any woman in Tudor England, baldness was shame. For a queen, it was unthinkable. Monarchs were not simply rulers, they were living symbols of divine favor. To appear weak, diseased, or disfigured threatened not only personal dignity, but the stability of the entire realm. So Elizabeth's artisans crafted wigs of human hair, dyed the brilliant auburn she once possessed. They sculpted towering hairpieces with intricate curls, padded and pinned into fantastical shapes, crowned by gold and jewels. Each wig was brushed with perfumed powders to mask the rank smell of decay rising from her scalp. The Queen's collection of wigs grew vast, each style tailored for state councils' banquets or receiving foreign ambassadors. But beneath them lay sores that never healed. Her lifelong use of white lead makeup and mercury-laced rouges inflamed her skin, burning it into raw lesions. Each wig rubbed against these wounds, tearing scabs and seeding infection deeper. No one dared speak of it. Court painters continued to immortalize her with thick curls framing her ivory-painted face, her eyes sharp with imperious power. But in private, removing her wig revealed the truth: a frail, aging woman's scalp mottled with scars, the last threads of her hair clinging like dying vines on frost-bitten branches. And still each morning she rose to don her armor of illusion, her ruffs, her gowns, her crimson lips, and her towering false hair. For Elizabeth knew that a queen's power was never merely in her armies or her laws. It lived in her image, an unbreakable myth that must remain untouched by death or age. Because in a world of men where beauty was power and decay was doom, even a queen's hair couldn't be her own. It belonged to the legend she became, and the lie that kept her throne secure. Secret 3: The Phantom Pregnancy. In the winter of her reign, when Elizabeth was deep into her 40s, a strange rumor began to coil through the hushed halls of her court. It started with whispers among her closest ladies, a subtle swelling beneath her embroidered bodices, a heaviness to her step, a change in the rhythms of her body. Soon the whispers grew into murmurs of awe and fear. Was England's Virgin Queen pregnant? She herself believed it, or so her maids later confessed in quaking voices. Elizabeth, who had ruled alone for decades, began to withdraw into her private chambers more often. She laid her hands upon her belly with a wonder that bordered on terror. She refused certain foods, demanded warm blankets piled upon her bed, and spoke softly of omens and divine blessings. But there was no announcement to the Privy Council, no prayers ordered for the birth of an heir. For this was a secret event, if it was an event at all. Doctors were summoned, men of herbs and humors, who understood little of a woman's hidden chambers. Some said she was merely ill with a swelling disease. Others whispered of tumors blooming inside her, like black roses. To suggest that the Virgin Queen carried a child was treasonous. To ask who the father might be was to risk the scaffold. Yet the swelling continued. Her gowns were altered, her steps slowed to a regal waddle. In her silent rooms with tapestries muffling every sound, Elizabeth prayed to a god she both feared and commanded. For an heir meant her throne would endure, her line would not die with her rotting corpse. For a brief flicker of time, hope and dread burned in her hollow chest. Then, as swiftly as it came, the swelling vanished. No cries of a newborn pierced the candlelit halls. No cradle was carved. No wet nurse summoned. The queen emerged thinner, paler, her eyes hollowed by something deeper than illness, a grief unspoken, a shame unrecorded. Modern historians believe it was a phantom pregnancy, a cruel trick of the body, brought on by her desperate longing for an heir, or perhaps by a tumor that mimicked the signs of life within. But in her court, people whispered darker possibilities. Poisoning witchcraft punishment from God for the blood spilled in her name. Some even whispered of a hidden birth and a child spirited away into silence, never to threaten the Tudor line. Whatever the truth, the phantom pregnancy remains a shadow on Elizabeth's legend, a reminder that beneath the lead paint and golden wigs was a woman of flesh and sorrow, her womb as empty as her marriage bed, and the Virgin Queen ruled on her crown a gilded cage, locking away the echoes of a child that never was. Secret, too. Her death was slow and terrifying. In the final winter of her reign, death crept upon Elizabeth Tudor like a silent predator, its claws hidden beneath the velvet drapes of her chamber. She was old now, near 70, her body a brittle shell armored in lead and jewels. But even as fever gnawed at her bones and her mind drifted into shadows, England's Virgin Queen refused to surrender to the darkness. For days she stood unmoving in her privy chamber. Her maids watched in silent terror as the Queen remained on her feet from dawn into night, swaying like a dying tree in winter winds. She refused her gilded bed, refusing to lie down, as if sleep itself was an admission of defeat. Her thin body, wrapped in layers of embroidered robes, began to bend under its own weight. Her face, once painted smooth and bright as porcelain, cracked to reveal the sores and scars beneath. Her eyes rheumy with age, and fever burned with a silent command. "Do not touch me." When her counselors begged her to rest, she turned her back and gazed at the flickering shadows cast by guttering candles. Her voice, once sharp enough to slice a nobleman's pride in a single sentence, became little more than a whisper. Yet within it remained the same iron that had ruled England for 44 years. Doctors were summoned to her side, men reeking of herbs and liniments bearing powders of gold and mercury. They saw the signs: her body bloated with dropsy, the unhealed ulcers on her legs leaking foul water that soaked her silk stockings. Some believed she was dying of blood poisoning from decades of white lead makeup seeping into her veins. Others spoke of pneumonia or sepsis from rotting teeth infecting her blood. But Elizabeth would not hear them. She waved away their potions and prayers. She refused to eat her tongue too swollen to swallow her breath reeking of decay. As death's grip tightened, she sank to the cold stone floor, refusing even a cushion resting her back against the bed she would not enter. For 3 days she sat like that, staring into nothing, lips moving in silent confessions or curses only she could hear. When at last her strength failed, they lifted her onto the bed she had rejected. Her eyes flickered across the faces of her maids, the portraits of her long-dead favorites, and the crown that glittered beside her pillow. She died before dawn, in the quietest hour, her frail chest rising one final time against the crushing weight of her legacy. To her counselors it was a queen's noble end. To her maids it was a haunting, the sight of power rotting alive. And to history it was the death of England's greatest ruler, alone and unmourned by any child, leaving behind an empty cradle and a throne stained by secrets no crown could ever cleanse. Secret 1, the cause of death they hid. When dawn broke over Richmond Palace on March 24, 1603, the Virgin Queen lay dead in her bed. Outside, Londoners wept and prayed for her immortal soul. Inside, a handful of physicians and lords gathered around her corpse, their faces pale with unspoken truths. Official proclamations declared she died of old age. 70 was a miracle in Tudor times, proof of divine favor. But behind closed doors, they whispered darker causes so gruesome they were never carved onto her tomb. Some believed her death was the final revenge of her own beauty. For decades, she had slathered her skin in white lead paint layer upon layer, day after day. The lead seeped into her blood, poisoning her organs, corroding her flesh from within. By her final weeks, sores bloomed across her face and neck. Her hair fell away in clumps, revealing raw scalp weeping pus beneath the powdered wigs. Others believed it was blood poisoning from her teeth, blackened and rotting to the jaw. Abscesses festered beneath her gums, leaking infection into her bloodstream. Each breath carried the scent of decay, her words curling with a sweetness so rancid it turned stomachs of hardened courtiers. Then there were those who whispered of hidden cancers, tumors swelling within her womb or belly, explaining her phantom pregnancy years before. Growths so invasive they tore through flesh and bone, causing the swelling of her legs and the dark bruises that blossomed across her dying skin. When they prepared her body for embalming, her ladies wept to see the truth hidden beneath the silk and jewels. Her corpse decayed with unnatural speed, her skin peeling from her bones as if in punishment for a life built upon painted illusions. Some believed it was divine wrath. Others saw witchcraft, a queen so feared, so envied that curses clung to her flesh even in death. The room was sealed, the cause of death recorded as mere old age in royal ledgers. Her body was hidden away, behind gold-clad oak, lowered into the vaults beneath Westminster Abbey, where no eyes could ever again see the decay that claimed her. But rumors survived the grave. They said her face was blackened by the poisons she once painted upon it, that her limbs stiffened in twisted angles, her mouth frozen half open as if gasping against her final terror. That when they lowered her coffin, the scent of rotting lead and blood drifted from its seams, curling through the abbey's stone halls, like the final confession of a queen who had ruled with iron, but died as fragile flesh. And thus ended the reign of Elizabeth I, England's greatest monarch, whose life was power, and whose death was a secret so horrific they buried it beneath centuries of golden lies. So now you know. The secrets Elizabeth I took to her grave. A queen worshipped as divine, yet rotting behind white lead masks. A virgin in legend, yet haunted by rumors of hidden births and lost heirs. A ruler of iron, will yet dying alone, her body decaying faster than her legend could shield. These were the 10 shocking secrets they tried to hide. Because power is never pure. It festers. It poisons. It demands its tribute in flesh bone and silence. Which secret unsettled you the most? Tell us in the comments below. And before you leave this dark hall of history, like, subscribe, and share to keep these hidden horrors alive. Because here in history's hidden horrors, the past never rests in peace.